Good afternoon. My name is Callie Stinson. I work for the World Economic Forum, which is an international organization for public-private collaboration. Now that you've all had your crash course in blockchain from Grantley, I guess I get the fun job of having a more abstract conversation with all of you to offer some reflections, I guess, on all the sort of tech movement that we're a part of from a governance perspective. Within the World Economic Forum, I help to run our Global Water Initiative, which is focused on ensuring at a high level that water remains quite central to our economic planning and decision-making as our global context continues to evolve. So I thought what I would use a couple minutes today to do with all of you is to just offer a couple reflections based on what we've heard so far, perhaps drawing upon the World Economic Forum's approach to advanced technology and kind of what we see at stake, I guess you could say, when it comes to policy and governance in the future of technology. And then offer a couple remarks on what I think this means in the context of water, before finally maybe teeing up a couple ideas on where we as a water community need to focus or might want to focus in order to kind of make the most of this technology transformation that we find ourselves in. So as I mentioned, the World Economic Forum is a platform for public-private collaboration. And I think what we've really started to see is that the very evolution of collaboration is indeed changing in the face of what we call the fourth industrial revolution. What is the fourth industrial revolution? Tricky question, but I think you could characterize it at a high level by the sort of speed and scale with which these technologies are emerging, but also starting to converge. And when they converge, how they start to reshape society. And indeed, we're seeing this across all parts of society, from infrastructure to how we deliver public goods and services, but also how we manage and understand and distribute natural resources, which is why we're all here today. This is very important, as the history of industrialization and the environment, I think everyone would agree, has in many ways been one of unintended consequences so far. So, we have the process of industrialization throughout history, which has given us great things, the Great Acceleration, for example. We know that, life expectancy has gone up, the number of people living in absolute poverty has gone down. These are very good things. But the environmental consequences of industrialization have been not quite as pretty, I think you could say, from climate change to water, but also oceans, forestry, biodiversity. We're seeing the implications of industrialization wreak havoc on our environment. And now we're at a place where 4 of our 9 planetary boundaries have been crossed. So these are tipping points, irreversible thresholds that have now been surpassed. So all of that to say that the fourth industrial revolution comes at a pretty interesting time in history for us. At the Forum, we see this has enormous potential to trigger the next wave of both human and environmental progress. But that's not going to happen automatically, and we really can't be so naive. There's plenty of examples. You can maybe start to deduce even a bit from what Grantley's talked about so far, but where you can start to see how things could go either way, depending on how we navigate this tech transformation. One of the examples that I talk a lot about is actually in the ocean space, where we are trying to wrestle with a lot of problems around illegal fishing. So even in the tuna fishing industry, which is a subsector of a much bigger space, this is a $40 billion industry. And yet illegal fishing is a totally pervasive problem that's in some places chewing up almost a quarter of the fishing industry. So like 1 in 4 fish are in some places being captured illegally. From a tech perspective, there's a lot that we can do to address this issue, which people are working on. So when we look at transparency and traceability in fisheries and the suite of technology solutions that can be deployed to help correct these issues, we can really start to move the needle. But equally, the rich streams of kind of information on ocean conditions and fish stocks and biodiversity and the various activities that are taking place in the ocean at any given time, if that stuff falls into the wrong hands, it can also be used to intensify illegal fishing. So for example, by helping boats to pinpoint where the fish stocks are and go and then collect all of the fish, or perhaps to evade governance and enforcement vehicles who are perhaps patrolling the water. You can also envision a context, I'm sure, in which the data and location and habitats of protected species can guide poachers on land. So for example, we've had instances in which poachers are using tourists' geo-tagged photos on social media of them next to the elephant. That's actually informing how poachers are going to find animals that they're looking to hunt. These are kind of scary illustrative examples from other environmental domains. But what do they tell us? I think that they illustrate something that's important, which is that understanding and navigating the fourth industrial revolution is actually much more about a focus on the systems in which our technologies operate and the values that underpin those systems than it is about any one given technology. So that is to say, while there's of course still a need to better understand and appreciate the power of many of these emerging technologies, blockchain is a good example, the forum is much more focused on the potential impacts that all of this has on the industries, societies, and economies, as well as the implications on the governance needs. That's our focus. We're not as much interested in the, how cool or awesome an individual technology is. So, when we look at all of this in the context of water, similar to oceans and illegal fishing or biodiversity, there's quite a bit at stake, which won't be news to any of you. But we know that water is both a public good and a basic human right. It's also, in very real terms, a threat and a risk, I think, for global economies. When we look at the nexus of water and food and energy, we know that there are implications for supply chains, human security, as well as national and regional stability. So all of that to say that we really need to get these 21st century water management decisions and policies right. And technologies offer a really interesting opportunity as well as a whole new set of risks in order to do that. So far we've heard a couple really interesting examples, I think, of how technology is already being deployed on water-related challenges. And I think that really underscores something that we spent a lot of time at the forum talking about, which is that water is in a really interesting place right now as a sector. From a sustainable development perspective, when you put water alongside the telecoms industry or the mobility industry or the energy industry or health, even food, I think you could argue that the water sector is lagging behind somewhat when it comes to innovation adoption. We're seeing some pockets of innovation certainly springing up, and there's a lot of promising proof cases, but it's not quite happening at scale at the speed that we're seeing elsewhere. Why? Complicated question. I don't have the answer to it. But what I will say is it's interesting, because what we have is a $700 billion industry that is basically ripe for innovation. And water, in many ways, is just a problem that's begging for solutions. And as my colleague mentioned, the technology will come. That's not a question. The solutions will be developed at some point. How we prepare for that transformation and that sort of tidal wave of innovation when it does come to the water sector, and the extent to which we're positioned to kind of meet that head on and shape that transformation is really what's in question. And at the World Economic Forum, through our Water Security Rewired platform, these are the types of questions that we are exploring. So through our collaboration with the World Bank and the Swiss Agency for Development Cooperation and others, we're looking at how best we can harness technology to accelerate progress on SDG 6. So maximizing the opportunities, but also minimizing the risks. So let's talk about some of those opportunities and risks as they pertain to water. Just quickly, I think a big on the opportunity side, Grantley talked a lot about this already, but transparency is huge. When we think about transboundary water management, for example, what might it mean for basins to have a more complete and real-time understanding of supply and demand that's underpinned by, as he mentioned, a fully transparent and tradable allocation scheme that doesn't need to be vetted by third parties? This would drastically change the landscape of water trading. And what if that system, to sort of build upon the technology brainstorming, could be actually just underpinned by real-time information for water users that they could have at their fingertips on mobile phones that would give them maybe the latest climate projections and market information to enable them to make smarter choices? You can start to envision this. Equally, from a city's perspective, we're here at a city's conference, for decision makers at a city level to have better insight, to make more actionable choices across integrated planning from conjunctive surface and groundwater modeled against climate change, to do better projections and navigate some of these trade-offs when it comes to investment decisions in both the short and long term. You can stack up a lot of different technologies to make us smarter and more capable of doing that. Plenty of solutions exist today, but I think the opportunity space that we're starting to see more people get into is what happens when you stack all of these things on top of each other, and what is the cumulative impact that this can have for decision makers on the ground. So these are just a couple examples to underscore that the opportunities are wide and wide-reaching, but there's also quite a few challenges and risks that I think we'll want to probably spend a bit of time talking about in the context of the discussion when it comes to scaling technology for water. Just to take through a few, the adoption and trust barriers with this stuff is a big one. So for example, when we talk about democratizing water data, we have to think through this carefully because there are always winners and losers. And some people have a vested interest, for example, in keeping the status quo. If you're a farmer and you're over-extracting groundwater, or if you're a government and you happen to have poor water quality, you probably don't have a keen interest to make all of that information more open and available. Similarly, even when we talk about democratized access, that doesn't necessarily answer questions around data ownership, right? So who does this data belong to when we open it up? Does it belong to the farmer? Does it belong to the device manufacturer, the cloud storage facility, the government? These are a lot of really gnarly questions that we don't have answers to. And even when information is not controlled, our digital literacy as a society is still its own barrier in many ways. So there's plenty of examples of where I think the lack of capacity and understanding and awareness of how to manage technology is something that we're still struggling with. Equally, as my colleague up here mentioned, the finance and investment to scale is absolutely a boundary that we haven't quite, or a threshold we haven't quite crossed. So we know that there's a lot of startups and entrepreneurs that are working in this space, but currently only a very small percentage, for example, of what goes into clean tech goes into water. The last thing that I'll say, and then I'll wrap up, is that a lot of these technologies are at varying levels of maturity. They need space to evolve, both in their application in the water sector, but also more broadly. So how and where we create the space for this experimentation to happen is very much at the center of the challenges that we need to work through at this point in time. So all of that is to say, we have quite a big task ahead of us from an enabling environment perspective. We need to invest in these innovation ecosystems. We have to get the finance and the investment to help these technologies thrive and scale, and to do so with a healthy amount of competition. And this is super important. And our colleague here, when we think about accelerators and tech incubators, they have a very important role to play to ensure that there is that healthy degree of competition and that our technologies aren't developed by a very few and powerful set of actors. And then from a policy perspective, I think governments are ultimately the ones that are accountable for ensuring that these technologies are developed and scaled responsibly. They need new policy frameworks and protocols to guide how these technologies are tested and refined. But governments aren't in a position to do this alone anymore. Governments cannot necessarily keep pace with the changes that we're seeing in technology. So there's a much bigger role that industry and civil society need to be able to come to play in setting those new policy frameworks and guidelines collectively with government in order to do that. So we need a pretty robust multi-stakeholder conversation in order to happen, which we're getting to. And we need these platforms that can sort of bring these actors together in new ways so that the tech and the policy aren't developed in silos. By closing, I will just say that I think the tech breakthroughs that we're seeing, combined with some of these innovations in finance and partnerships and governance, when we pull all that together, institutions like the Forum or others that kind of work in this brokering space can certainly help tech-enabled solutions become more useful and accessible for decision makers who are kind of on the front lines of managing all these water challenges. But the bottom line is that we as a community, meaning those of us on stage, those of you in the audience, and all of the networks that we represent, really need to work together to shift this existing dynamic and build this enabling environment together if we're going to make the most of this tech transformation. Thank you.